I'm Hunter Atkins, CEO of the Bank of Nashville. Today's CEO Cafe, which is brought to you by the Bank of Nashville, is a cooperative effort with our local Chamber of Commerce. Today's speaker is Dr. KenWong. He's the Annenberg Professor and Chair of the Education Department at Brown University. His topic today is going to be on urban education and the mayor's role in urban education as a strategy. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Wong to our city.
Let me share with you some of my ideas on governance challenge. First of all, we know that there are a lot of very good schools, and they've been around this country for a long time. But the question today for us is that, are we satisfied with just a handful of very successful schools? Or are we interested to think about the system as a whole? That is, how can we elevate the individual success stories to the system as a whole so that we can be proudly claim that urban districts are a successful school system as a whole? So this is the challenge that we need to be thinking about. Can we think about some system-wide strategies that would enable the system to have the right mix of conditions, that would allow teachers and principals to do their job better, that would buffer the political process, that would allow the urban district to go to the state legislature and the federal administration to ask and justify for more federal grants and intergovernmental grants to urban schools? And can we bring in best practices from outside of the education system so that we can diversify the expertise of the system and run the urban school district not only as a teaching and learning enterprise, but also as a very complex organization where we need to balance the budget, negotiate with the teachers' union, and bring in high standards and continue to hold people accountable for results and performance. How do we do all of these? Well, the first step that we need to be thinking about is governance coherence. And today I'm going to share with you one approach to start thinking about governance coherence. This is not the only approach in terms of governance coherence. There are other ways to think about it. But my research in the last 15 years have been focusing on what the mayors can do. And what I'm going to share with you is a synthesis of what we learned in the last 15 years, particularly with respect to how do we compare systems that are under mayoral leadership as opposed to those systems that are not under mayoral leadership. Are we seeing better student performance? Are we seeing better management performance? Are we getting a stronger dose of trust? Do we see improved school climate? Those are the questions that we need to be thinking about. And in my book called The Education Mayor, what we have found is that based on the student achievement data of 5 years, longitudinal data for 100 largest school districts, and based on 10 years of management and school funding data, of these 100 largest school systems, what I found is very, very straightforward. One, mayoral control improves student achievement statistically significantly in a positive way as compared to the elected school board, as far as the largest school systems are concerned. Second, mayoral control improves management performance. They are able to institute fiscal solvency, raise the bond rating. So if you look around the urban school systems where they were 5 years ago before mayoral control, and then looking at their bond rating, they improved the bond rating significantly. They were able to reduce school overcrowding and fix a lot of the teaching and learning problem by broadening the pipeline of the human capital supply, including principals and teachers. So what I'm going to share with you is some of the findings from the book. But I also try to go beyond that a little bit because when we published the book, the data was already a couple of years old, and it takes a long time to go through the academic publishing process. So by now it's a little bit dated, but right now I'm currently updating a lot of these data, city by city. So I'm going to show you at least what I found in New York City as well. So if you look at the broad picture here, currently about 2/3 of all the states actually have the legislation that would allow the mayor or the state to come in and intervene in low-performing situations. And an appointed school board is now in place in a lot of our largest urban school systems, including New York City, Boston, Chicago, and Providence, my community right now. I actually serve on the school nominating commission appointed by the mayor, so I'm deeply engaged in what the Providence school system is doing right now. And the interesting thing is that we also have Washington, D.C., which has an elected school board, but the power of the elected school board has been significantly transformed into an advisory function. So they no longer has the appropriations and the authority to appoint the school superintendent. Instead, the mayor actually have direct control over the appointment of the chancellor. So now if you add all of these students in all these systems under mayoral leadership, we are talking about 2 million, a little bit over 2 million school children. That's about the same size as all of the enrollment in charter schools in the entire country. So in other words, we have two very interesting systems going on right now, if broadly defined systems. Two very different reform approach. One is mayoral involvement. There's the mayor would appoint the school board, be the CEO, and then the CEO would then recruit educators to run the curriculum and instruction. But then you also have the school choice that is going on right now. And these two, I think, will be in competition with one another in the next 10 to 20 years. I think it's a very exciting, a very healthy development, because we need some competition, institutional competition in the public school sector. And I think this is a very healthy development in that regard. So if you look at the rationale in terms of designing this system, the first one is that the mayors would like to have the flexibility and the tools to do his or her job system-wide. Because if you only get the mayors to partner with a subset of schools, the mayor's hands will be tied, because the mayors would not be able to engage in union bargaining, collective bargaining, which significantly affect the time that we allocate and the allocation of teachers and so on. And so the mayor needs the system-wide approach to deal with some of these system-wide systemic challenges. And the second systemic challenge that I laid out here is institutional fragmentation. Too often, if you ask why the superintendent is not doing his or her job, the superintendent would say that, well, it is really the union problem. And the union would say that it is the school board problem. The school board would say it is the state legislature problem. We need more money. State legislature is the governor's problem. And so you have a blame game going on in circle. And what we need is one single office that is ultimately accountable. The buck has to stop somewhere. And I think it should stop at the mayor's office. Based on my research, I feel that ultimately the mayor's office is the single office where you have citywide electoral process to hold the mayor accountable, and that you've got the reputation and the charisma of that office. The mayor individual may not have personal charisma, and I've seen a lot of mayors around the cities that may not have personal charisma, but the office is respected because it has institutional charisma, because it represents the city as a whole, and it is subject to 4-year accountability electoral process. So the mayor's office would be in a uniquely qualified position to integrate educational performance with electoral accountability. So if the mayor is not doing a good job, voters across the city can actually hold the mayor accountable in the next electoral cycle and vote the mayors out of office. And in fact, Mayor Bloomberg and Chicago Mayor Daley, all of these mayors who've taken control over the school system are actually highlighting the educational commitment in their electoral campaign. So education all of a sudden is being elevated to be an institutional agenda. It's no longer on the sideline. So it's no longer being marginalized as a secondary issue in the city. Because as you know, because of the demographic trends, only about 25% or 30% of the residents in the city have children. And some of them may not send their kids to public school. So you are talking about only a subset of the population that have a direct connection to the public school system. So the mayor's office would bring some balance to the lack of attention to public school, because the mayor would have to think about, how do I manage taxpayers' concern? Because after all, taxpayers are paying for the public school system. So the mayor immediately would broaden that conversation. And when the media talks, the editorial board would come and listen. And so I think it is very important for us to think about a single office being in charge and be held accountable for educational performance. Right now, there are three ways to, across the country, there are three ways to get the mayors involved in a formal way. One is by state legislation. The other is that the state can actually pass a legislation and call for a local referendum. So the voters in the community can come out to decide whether they want mayoral control or not. And that happened in Boston a couple of times and Cleveland a couple of times. And the third is to change the city charter in Oakland, California, back when Mayor Brown was the mayor in year 2000. So for example, in Chicago, it was through the first route, through the state legislature, passed a legislation in 1995, and Mayor Daley was given the control over the school system. And this is a situation where I consider as a complete mayoral control model. And that is the mayor would appoint all the school board members, and the mayor also appoint the CEO of the system. And the CEO in turn would appoint the chief education officer. So some of the skeptics are concerned that, well, the mayor doesn't know anything about education. How can he be in charge of education, public education? But this is actually not how it works, because through this model, the mayor actually have to rely on an educator to be the chief education or the chief academic officer. So the role of the educators are not actually being diminished. The role of the educator actually being buffered and protected by the mayoral office in case there are political fighting and lobbying going on. So the mayor can actually buffer that to protect and facilitate the condition under which the education officer can do his or her job. And what I found is that in Chicago, as well as other mayoral control districts, they also enter multi-year union contract, which create labor peace. So I was talking to an NPR reporter not too long ago, and he asked me, why isn't there as many teacher strikes going on in urban cities? And one of the points that I made during that interview was that because you are now seeing more mayoral involvement, and mayoral contribution in this whole process is one that would ensure labor peace through multi-year contracting. So in Chicago, for example, before the mayor took over, there were 9 strikes in the previous 13 years. And after the mayor took over in 95 to now, 2008, 13 years, you don't see any strike. So 13 years, you've got 9 strikes. 13 years post-mayor, you don't see any teacher strike. And we're talking about pretty strong labor union. So labor peace, I think, is very, very important. And getting the public trust is the job of the mayor as well. And that's what I'm seeing as well across the country. Bloomberg talks to the community all the time. And it varies from city to city. And some mayors need to sharpen their communication skills and coming to the community and so on. But by and large, they understand the important stakes involved because they are being held accountable for performance. So does it matter? And my findings show that mayoral control, as I said earlier, at the very, very beginning of my talk, is that it does matter. And after 2 years of mayoral control, I would expect that the standard deviation, these are kind of a statistical analysis that we did with all the student achievement. What we found is that we have the, so what I found is that this is 0.15 to 0.15 standard deviation. That's a significant. So it varies from district to district, but by and large, what we are talking about is that we are talking about 4 months of learning, 4 to 5 months of learning. That is, after mayoral control, in a couple of years, 2-3 years, you are seeing an improvement of 4 to 5 months of learning. Now, if you are looking at the lowest performing schools, they are likely to catch up quite a bit. And if you look at New York City, this is what we are seeing. So Bloomberg took control in 2002, 2003, around that time. So you can see that there is a jump. So the yellow line is really the New York City performance 4th grade math. Now, the blue line is very important because most often we don't usually compare with the non-city peers when we look at student performance. Oftentimes, we just look at, does the system, is it doing better today than yesterday? That's one way to do it. But I'm using a more tougher standard here. Are we catching up with the rest of the state? So the rest of the state does not include New York City. This is the rest of the state, and they consist mostly of suburban and non-urban children, and which is a tougher benchmark to compare. So what I found is that if you look at this trend line, what we are seeing is the narrowing of the gap between New York City after Bloomberg took over. Instead of staying at the 50th percentile range, we are seeing catching up to pretty close to what the rest of the state are performing in math. And similar trends are found in reading, in different grades, in high school. But I just want to show you one that I thought that it would be quite illuminating to see. So this is what I mean by the 0.15 to 0.19 standard deviation change. These are marginal gains. That is, assuming that poverty is not being altered, racial and ethnic composition, ELL students, all of these social, economic, demographic challenges are not alterable. Given that they are not alterable, mayoral control provided a marginal impact. That's even if you have 80% poor kids in your district, the fact that with mayoral leadership in these urban districts, you are seeing a real gain. Okay, you are seeing a real gain of 4 months of learning. And this is an aggregation of that. Does mayoral control work? And we can also look at other management and budgetary allocation. And as I said, I've got 10 years of data from the Common Core of Data, which is coming from the National Center for Education Statistics. And what we found is that mayoral control did not actually raise the taxpayers' burden, but instead they tried to redeploy their resources in a strategic way. So as I said, they already engage actively in multi-year union contract. They try to contain labor cost so that they could do more things with the classroom. So this is what we found. After a couple of years, what we found is that mayors wanted to move more resources down for instructional purposes, down to the classroom. So the myth was that if you have a politician in charge of education, it is likely the politician would behave the way politicians do, which is to look after their friends and neighbors and so on and create a general purpose, central office, expand central office. But that was not the case empirically. What we found is that they did not expand the central office staff. Instead, they reallocated resources. And in some situations, what I found is that the lowest performing 20% of the schools actually receive a lot of these additional resources. Because the mayor understands that in order to be held accountable every 4 years, he or she needs to really level up the lowest performing schools. And one way to do it is to allocate more resources in terms of instructional support staff to the lowest performing schools. So these are some of the empirical evidence that I covered so far. For example, in Chicago, they were able to raise the bond rating. And also, when I analyzed the mix of managers that were being recruited post-mayoral control, what I found is that 40% of the new managers actually came from non-public education background. So they would bring in master in public policy who runs big, public hospital or public library, county government. Paul Vallis, for example, who was the superintendent in Chicago and now in the New Orleans Recovery School District. And he was a budget director. He didn't have an EDD or a PhD in education. He was a budget director. And so he understands how to balance the budget, how to use resources strategically. And these are the new breed of leaders that I'm seeing following mayoral control. But what I found is that if I have to come up with a list of possible conditions that I learned that I could synthesize across all these districts under mayoral control, what are some of these conditions? Well, we need to really have clear strategic goals that are achievable. Is one way to think about, okay, in the year 2014, 100% of our kids are going to be proficient. These are stretch goals. They are fine. We'll keep it there. But at the same time, mayors also are thinking about strategically feasible goals so that the whole community could buy in and be able to accomplish. And then second is that they focus on performance accountability, both at the school level as well as the central office level. So for example, Michelle Rhee, when she first became the Chancellor of Washington, D.C., when I talked to her, the first thing that she told me was that when people call the hotline in Washington, D.C., nobody answered the phone. And I want to change that. I want to have somebody pick up that phone in 2 minutes, and within 24 hours, we'll get that request to the appropriate agency or unit, and then have that agency reply to the complaint or concerns of the parents and the community, and that is done. So that's very, very important. It's not just test scores that we are talking about. It's also management performance-based accountability, that the people's job ought to be held accountable for their clients' needs, and I think that's what you are seeing. I think bringing a portfolio approach is what I'm seeing across the board in a lot of mayors. And what they are talking about is that we are not afraid of charter school. We are not afraid of school choice. Let there be healthy competition. That's okay to have charter school. It's okay to have competition. In Washington, D.C., 40% of school-age children are actually attending charter school in Washington, D.C. And Michelle Rhee said that, well, let's build some bridges. Let's learn from what they are doing well in terms of communication and outreach. Maybe the public school system can improve as well. So mayors are not afraid to deal with the broader portfolio, and I think that's a healthy development. Instead of entering into immediate adversarial relationship with all these potential partners, they're talking about building partnerships. So we are seeing mayors who are interested in Teach for America, the New Teachers Project, engaging higher education sector to think about the transition from school to work and so on and so forth. So we are seeing a lot of these kind of leveraging activities, and the mayor, as I said, is in a unique position to do this kinds of leveraging and make the public education a common enterprise, not only the concern of the educators, make it into the concern of everybody in the wider community. And so what are some of the options if one is going to think about governance redesign? So one would be to have complete mayoral control, like the one in Chicago, in New York City. Or you can have shared governance between the mayor and the state. And that sometimes works out, sometimes it gets a little bit complicated. And I think it's up to the particular community to be thinking about that. But the challenge for you all in this room and beyond is that here are some of the questions that people need to be thinking about if they are interested to take to the next step in terms of governance redesign and change the way we govern our schools in Metro Nashville. So the first question is timing right? Is the timing appropriate for governance reform? Broadly defined, not just mayoral involvement, but broadly defined. Is the timing right? And my understanding is that Metro is now under restructuring 1, so it is likely to go into restructuring 2, may or may not. But it sounds like that here is an opportunity for a community-wide conversation. And my understanding is that the state is playing an increasingly active role in terms of intervening staffing and also finance and curriculum. And so is the public opinion supportive? I haven't seen any poll in Nashville, but I think that would be something that we need to be thinking about downstream. Who will oppose the reform? Oftentimes, the elected school board in general are very skeptical of the reform. Teachers union in general are skeptical of reform. But on the other hand, the business community, the civic community, as well as parents, oftentimes are quite supportive of the reform. But maybe it's not the case in Nashville. I'll have to learn more about that, given my absence away from Nashville for 3 years. Is the mayor ready to lead? I think this is a very, very important question. And that is ultimately the mayoral office has to allocate the political capital to make it work. Very, very simple example. In a lot of these districts that I study with regard to mayoral involvement, the first thing that the mayor did was to sit down with the police chief, with the street and sanitation agency. Why is that? Because when the snow comes, or when, here it may not be applicable. In Chicago, for example, when snow comes, schools are shut down for 10 days. Now that doesn't make sense. It stopped learning for 10 days. So the mayor actually worked with the street and sanitation director to make sure that the first priority among all the public buildings are the schools, and that gets done because of mayoral control. And then gangs and graffiti and all these other challenging issues. The police chief would have to work with the mayor and the school chief in order to coordinate some of these activities. So the mayor would have to spend some of the political capital internally as well as externally to lead the district. Is the mayor ready to lead and be willing to allocate some of these resources to make it work? Not only to just build new partnership, but also to really drill down and to look at the existing way things are done in the school system. Is the mayor willing to take that approach? What are the opportunity costs if the mayor is not involved? I think that's a big question that we need to be thinking about. Maybe the state would come in and initiate a state takeover, which may or may not be in the best interest of the folks here in Nashville. And how do you sustain support for the reform? I think that's a very important question that a lot of mayors are just beginning to think about, because oftentimes they are thinking about, okay, I've got a 4-year electoral cycle, and here is how I would map out my way of involving in public education. So it's usually it's driven by electoral concern, right? And which is a legitimate concern, because fixing school is really important for the economy as well as for the overall civic culture of the community. So the mayor has that responsibility. But I would encourage mayors to also go beyond that 4-year cycle and be thinking about how do you build the institution, not just thinking about, okay, I'm the mayor and I'm involved today and I'm going to make my impact. But we need to be thinking about using one institution, the mayor's office, to build another, to strengthen another institution, which is public school district. And so just to sum up, I think ultimately, I think there are 2 key benefits that I see from my study about mayoral control. And all of these are supported by empirical evidence. One is it really strengthens internal accountability. So internally, you bring in a broader pool of expertise, you balance the budget, you could institute a stronger sense of innovation, you can bring in other practices, lessons learned, you can build partnership. But externally, I think it's just as important. I think educational system for too long has been insulated from the mainstream electoral political accountability process, because school board members are elected off years, maybe off season, off months, and you've got very, very low voters turnout. And I think it is time for the 2 systems to connect so that you can have educational performance more closely connected to the mainline electoral cycle in November. And so I think this is very important. And then there are other ways to think about accountabilities and checks and balances. Even when the mayor gets involved, you can set up a school board nominating commission to make sure that the mayors will pick from that slate of potential candidates, qualified candidates. And you could have budgetary oversight by the city council. You could have the approval and review process, just like our federal model. There's the advice and consent, okay, on the legislative branch, and then you've got the executive branch running the operational side as well as the vision, as well as pushing the vision for public education. So if you need more information, let me know, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today. Thank you.
You highlighted several very strong mayors.
Yes.
And what about if you don't have, if you had Detroit as one of your examples rather than?
Yes. Yeah, Detroit tried. And Mayor Dennis Archer was the one who worked with the state legislature and said that I really wanted to gain some control over the school system. But his attempt was incomplete. So he was only able to attend a minority number of the school board. And the president of the school board, if I recall at the time, was actually the state commissioner. So he was actually not able to get the whole way. So his attempt was incomplete. And then the other problem in Detroit is that a lot of the administrators in the central office are highly unionized. They belong to the central office administrators union. So when I interviewed the CEO at the time, He said that I can only control 40, around 40 staff, and beyond that, I can't do much about it. So in other words, this is a model that we don't want to move forward. If folks here are interested and curious about a workable, functional model of mayoral control, Detroit is not the way to do it. But we actually included Detroit as part of our analysis. So if we take out Detroit, some of the achievement findings would have gone even higher. But we included Detroit because at the time we thought that we should include all the mayoral control, even though it is a partly controlled system. And I think you've got into another very, very good point, and that is that we are talking about an institution, and we want to think about how to build or rebuild an institution. And the last thing that I would like to see, even though a lot of mayors that I work with always personalize the achievement of that district, right? So Mayor Bloomberg would say that it's because of Mayor Bloomberg, that I really, bring about all these changes. But I would like all the mayors to start thinking about moving away from that, even though there is a temptation to claim credit, which is totally legitimate. But at the same time, from a social science perspective, it is important to think of public education and mayoral office as institutions. And can we build procedures and conditions and then institutionalize those procedures and conditions? So one of the examples would be the budgetary approval process. So that might be one way where we could share the leadership a little bit. So instead of just having a single mayor in charge of the budget, management, appointment of the CEO, and the school board members, then you share some of the responsibility and let the city council or other entities to play a meaningful role to balance that out.
I read your book and tried to do a little research myself, which of course that's limited at best. I didn't see many cities that had mayoral term limits, where the mayor had taken over the schools, and I became concerned, and I could be wrong, but but of course when you look at Bloomberg and Daley, they definitely they're mayors for life if they want to be properly. But I know you talked about the budget process and sharing, but what kind of risk are you taking when, like, we have Mayor Dean, who is an education mayor, but maybe our next mayor might not be an education mayor? How do you protect the schools in that situation?
It's along the same vein. That's exactly what my worry too. That is, even though the findings right now is capturing some of the very positive outcomes as a result of mayoral takeover, but I'm worried about the second generation, as these are first generation mayors. They initiated the takeover or control initiative, and they are well aware of the importance of education within their own vision. So probably mayors are politically calculative in general. They are politicians, so they need to be thinking about how public education will fit into their larger scheme of winning strategy, building coalition. And the next generation may not be looking at education. They might be looking at safety or housing or some other issues. So the question that we need to be thinking about is that, can we ensure that there are some institutional conditions that would transcend a particular mayor? So there are several of them. So one is that if you look around the country, a lot of these mayors are also creating new position called deputy mayor in charge of education. So that's an elevated position where, regardless of who the mayor is not likely to go away once that position is being established. Or that if you have the city council involved in reviewing and approving the selection of the CEO. And the third would be the setting up of the school board nominating process, which I proudly serve in my city. And what we did was we went all the way out to actually do a lot of outreach, and then we identify a list of candidates, bring 10 in, just like this, where they actually are videotaped and broadcasted, and also ask them tough questions about what their visions are, how to change the culture and things like that. And that process has been going on in Providence for quite some time. And I don't anticipate that the next mayor will wipe that out. So the longer that you keep a broad community support on some of these institutional mechanisms, the more likely that these mechanisms are going to continue, regardless of who the mayor is. Now, the electoral cycle is very interesting. Now, Bloomberg actually faced a term limit, and he was able to change it. Now, but the interesting thing is that he needed the city council to help him to change it. So that, again, is an institutional checks and balances. So if the city council members, the majority of them felt that, well, it's not a bad thing for the city right now to change the term limit. So it is really the will of the people, so to speak, to move forward. Now, I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing for education, but that's part of the, I mean, as long as the mayor goes through the political process, and I hope that all mayors would be thinking about that. That is, there ought to be some proper procedure that mayors need to be thinking about, and I encourage all of them to do so.
Kind of picking up on this board that you talked about in service, what characteristics have you found really work well for an appointed board? What are those characteristics for board members?
One is we need to have a diverse set of expertise. So, for example, as I said, we need to be thinking about shared responsibility and shared leadership within a very complex urban school district. So we need board members who would be sensitive to municipal bond rating, who would, and then another board member understand the connection between secondary education, high school education, and the labor market as well as post-secondary education. We need to have somebody who trained as a lawyer, and then other people trained as an educator. And what we try to do in the School Board Nominating Commission that we just submitted our recommendation was that I personally pay some attention to the folks who actually graduated from the public high school in the city. And because I've thought that they would also bring in additional perspective in terms of what they have gone through in the public education system. So the mayor would be able to balance out some of these diverse experience and expertise if we are talking about a school board nominating process. But ultimately, the mayor would have to interview all these final candidates, and then the mayor would also have to think about, you know, how to balance all of them. But that's what we did in terms of coming up with the set of criteria.
Have you noticed a set of common educational practices that mayors have put out there that have been specifically effective or less effective?
The first thing is core curriculum, because mayors are very concerned about student mobility. Very, very on. There are two things the mayors are very concerned. One is it's not just the AYP or state accountability. They are very concerned about student mobility. They understand that their population are coming from many different regions as well as countries. Many languages being spoken. So they are very concerned about student mobility. So they want to make sure that regardless of where the children are moving, sometimes they move 3 times, 4 times a year, right? So in other words, mobility could be 250%. So some of my students were scratching their head, how could mobility rate be 250%? So I said that, well, you change all these children 3 times in the course of your school year, because the children who showed up in August 15 are definitely no longer the children who show up in December 15, and then you change again March 15. So that's why you've got 250%. So in some schools in some of the big urban community, that's where the problem. So mayors are very, very interested in standardizing instruction and the content of the curriculum and the pace of those instructions. So they are moving forward with a lot of the core curriculum strategy. The second, I think mayors are very, very concerned about the pipeline of teachers. So when I met with our superintendent and mayor just 3 weeks ago, they were saying that we just cannot continue to have a single institution, even though they seem to be doing a reasonable job, a single higher education institution supplying 70% of all our public school teachers. We need to diversify that. So that's the second factors that I find in some of these cities that mayors have taken over. They try to build new partnerships. Now, although some of these new partnerships may not amount to a significant number, but they are sending an important signal to the larger community that we need to be thinking about a broader, diverse supply of teachers. And the third is that I think they are willing to hold principals accountable. So in New York, Chicago, and all these other places, they are beginning to look at principal as the CEO of that building. And that is, if the mayor wants to hold adults who work in the public school system accountable, the principal would be the very first layer that they are thinking. And I see that as actually a pretty successful strategy, because ultimately it's more complex to hold teachers accountable, as you know, because kids learning is a developmental process, it's an accumulating process. So by the time they get to the 8th grade, you cannot for sure say that the 8th grade reading teacher is doing a lousy job because he or she failed, right? Because you've got 7 previous years of learning. And what have the other teachers done to the same kid, right? And also student mobility. So core curriculum, fixing the pipeline, diversify the pipeline, hold the principal accountable, I think are some of the core strategies that I learned from these cities. Yeah.
You mentioned 3 different ways that cities change their laws to allow this to happen. State legislation, citywide referendum, or revising the charter. Of the cities that now have a mayor controlling the schools, is there one that's worked better than others, or what's the experience and how that comes about?
The enabling processes are entirely dependent on the state political process and also the city political culture. Now in the west of the Mississippi River, there seems to be a lot more citizen initiatives going on. So that's why Oakland goes with, first of all, the mayor created a commission, a community-based commission, plus some experts, to look at the city charter as a whole, and then generate a set of recommendations, and then put the recommendations before the voters. So that's how Oakland did it, through the revision of the city charter. So that they have a long tradition of having their own charter, but the voters would have to buy into that. So that's one model. The other model is that it depends on whether the state legislature has a tradition of adopting legislation that would intervene in situations of low performance. Now, my understanding is that in Tennessee, for example, way back in the early 1990s, you've got the, under Governor Lamar Alexander, you've got a School Education Act. And so that actually, when I look at it a while back now, that actually opened up for some kind of state or city intervention as a last resort. But now with the NCLB, the state is getting a little bit more active. So it is possible that in Tennessee, the state legislature and the governor might be interested in thinking about legislation, just like Illinois when they look at Chicago. In the case of Cleveland and Boston, again, they have a very decentralized system. So the state legislature was telling the city that, okay, we're willing to support you most of the way, but not quite. We want an assurance from your voter to make sure that they are buying into this notion of mayoral control. So in the case of Cleveland and in the case of Ohio legislature and Massachusetts legislature, they passed the legislation, so they also use legislation. But the nature of the legislation is different than the one in Illinois. The one in Illinois is that they passed the legislation and said that, okay, I'm going to give this authority to the mayor. Okay, so no ambiguity. But in the case of Massachusetts and Ohio, what they said was that we are going to approve it for the time being, but 2 years down the road or 4 years down the road, you need to have a referendum to reaffirm. If the referendum fails, that's it. We are not going to revisit that. Now, in the case of Bloomberg, it's also interesting. Bloomberg, if without, okay, very quick, without reauthorization this spring, the mayoral control in New York City is going to be terminated. So one design feature is that you can sunset the legislation, or you can sunset it in terms of date. You can sunset it in terms of conditions. You can say that, okay, but if the school district is coming back on track and meet the AYP 2 years in a row or 3 years consecutive years, then this legislation will expire. So that's another way to do it.
I like what you're saying about how the accountability is going to improve under the mayoral control. What would stop that accountability from taking place under the no mayoral control?
Under no mayoral control, well, the first thing is fragmentation. What I call everybody is blaming everybody. So the superintendent would say the union is in charge, and the union would say that the school board is in charge. Because ultimately, if we have not identified a single office that is ultimately accountable and responsible for education, this is what we are seeing. Now, under normal circumstances, it may be okay, because democracy is messy, right? And we all live with messiness. So this is entirely legitimate and acceptable. But under the situation where you have persistently failing schools for a long period of time, and perhaps mismanagement or huge budget deficit spending and things like that, and questionable quality, in terms of leadership, then I think you really need to be thinking about streamlining that accountability system. And that's what mayoral control is about. Right. Thank you.
On November the 9th, 2007, my daughter was brutally murdered by her husband, and my life changed forever. My name is Glenda, and I'm the survivor of a domestic violence victim. As parents or as a mother, you always think that you know your children and that you can protect your children through anything that happens in their life. She just graduated from college with a degree in criminal justice and was working on a second degree in paralegal assisting. Becca's passion in her life was, once she graduated, to work with abused children in the juvenile system and to work with women in the domestic violence arena. Unknown to me was the fact that she herself was being abused. I'm a nurse by profession, and we're taught to be observant, to see signs and symptoms and know what's going on with the person. And I just missed this. Maybe it's because I wasn't aware of what the signs and symptoms were. Or maybe I didn't want to see it. But I missed it big time, and I couldn't help Becca. I guess I should have known when she wasn't coming to church as much. And when the conversations got shorter And when I did get to talk to her, you could always hear him in the background, interrupting everything that was going on. But I just didn't. And I keep asking myself over and over why I didn't see it. There's 1 in every 3 women that are abused. And as individuals, we probably know ourselves somebody who's going through it. But do you know? Do you know those warning signs? We need to be able and willing to speak up, to set examples, to get involved, and to support our YW. And whatever we can do to stop this vicious cycle of abuse, so that people like my Becca and other daughters and family members aren't the victim that's left behind.
This is my story. My name is Mary Jones. My dream of living happily ever after ended the day I got married. It started with verbal and emotional abuse, controlling behavior, and isolating me from my family and friends. Some days were good, and that's why I stayed. Bad days became worse, and I knew I needed to leave. When I said I wanted to leave, that's when the physical abuse started. I feared for my life. I grabbed one dress, a few things for the kids, and I had what I had slept in. We had to get away, far away where he couldn't find us, where he couldn't hurt us. I have family in Nashville, but I feared involving them. So I went to the YMCA, and they told me about the YWCA, and they let me call from there. I called the YWCA crisis line, and they became my lifeline. We had found a safe place for the night. We were safe. The next day, I tried to bring a little more normalcy to our lives, so I enrolled the kids in school. Things seemed to be falling into place, but I was falling apart. I took care of my family, but I needed to take care of me. Why was this happening to me? This was a dream that had turned into a nightmare. I found safety, but I needed to understand. This prompted my second call to the YWCA crisis line. I called and I said I needed some help. She listened. I talked. She listened. She helped me to see that I needed support and care for the healing to begin. So she guided me to the YW support group for women, where women like me were suffering and women like me were healing. That very night, my children and I went looking for that hope and that healing. We found it at the YWCA support group. I told them that I didn't know what was wrong with me. Why can't I dry these tears? They knew why. They told me that I was in mourning. I had lost my husband, my home, my belongings, and life as I knew it. And I had to mourn this before I could begin the healing. We did begin to heal. We went week after week, and my children were helped by the YW youth counselors, and we became stronger and stronger. The YWCA gave me hope and courage. I have gained a sense of control. I am in charge of my life now. I make the decisions. I keep us safe. We're still vigilant because we can't and won't forget. This is my story. It continues now. Mary Jones and her family are in their own apartment and continue to attend the support groups weekly, sharing, giving, helping our family and others. Now that I can envision my future, I have taken my lifelong passion for sewing and I'm turning it into a career. I am enrolled in a fashion design college and I will soon be a tailor. I'm happy now. My children are happy now. We laugh. We laugh a lot. There's joy in my house. There's joy in our lives. Thank you, YWCA, for all you've done.
It's fun to sing,
zippity zip zip zin zin zin,
dance, and play music every day.
Yeah, go for it!
Doing something artistic inspires creativity and helps you succeed in school and life.
Hooray!
Play music, paint, and dance together as a family.
Come on, team!
Blast off with the arts.
Blast off!
For 10 ways to add the arts into your life, visit AmericansForTheArts.org.
Do you like this top? It's so gay.
Really?
Yeah, it's totally gay.
You know, you really shouldn't say that.
Say what?
Well, say that something's gay when you mean it's bad. It's insulting. What if every time something was bad, everybody said, oh, that's so girl wearing a skirt as a top?
Oh, you are.
Those are cute jeans, though. When you say that's so gay, do you realize what you say? Knock it off.
Being creative helps you succeed in school and life.
Hooray!
Play music, paint, and dance together as a family. For 10 ways to add the arts into your life, visit AmericansForTheArts.org.
Sounds like you could use some Van Gogurt. It's fortified with arts-rich nutrients to improve your math and reading skills. Catch!
Van Gogurt, thanks. So what's the deal with your ear?
Always with the ear, huh?
Feed your kids the arts. For 10 simple ways to learn how, visit AmericansForTheArts.org.
Honey? The credit fairy doesn't exist.
What?
It's make-believe. Nobody left anything under your pillow.
If there's no credit fairy, then we'll make our credit score go up.
We will. By doing things like paying our bills on time.
There's no magic to improving your credit, but there's help, and it's free. Go to creditfairy.org.
What?
Oh, those boys are much too much. Those boys are much too much. We got the spirit. We're hot. We can't be stopped. We got the spirit. We're hot. We can't be stopped. We're going to beat them and bust them. Beat them.
The smallest moments can have the biggest impact on a child's life.
Let's get a little bit rowdy. R-O-W-D-Y.
Take time to be a
One
dad
more
today.
time. Oh, those boys are much too much. Those boys.
Check out this chef, right? That's so gay. That's really gay. Dude, look at those pants.
Please don't say that.
What?
Don't say that something is gay when you mean that something is dumb or stupid. It's insulting. It's like if I thought this pepper shaker was stupid and I said, man, and this pepper shaker is so 16-year-old boy with a cheesy mustache. When you say that's so gay, do you realize what you say? Knock it off.
Yeah. Dad, do you want to get the phone? No.
If you're ignoring your mortgage issues, things will only get worse. Call today because nothing is worse than doing nothing.